few years back with Rocky Mountain Institute and other people on sort of from a cost perspective and energy savings. So this was an upgrade of the entire Empire State Building done 8 years ago, something like that. I don't know exactly. And this was, and I'm going to look at it from a carbon standpoint. So this was their where they started. You can see the annual CO2 emissions are 25,000 metric tons a year. So this is a big building. We all know that. And they looked at 60 different energy efficiency measures, and they considered 8, and 8 were selected as the most feasible. And they were mostly most feasible from a cost standpoint and the energy payback. One of the things they did that was really interesting was they took the existing windows out of the building. They were already double glazed windows. That had been done in the 80s. They were double glazed windows, and they took them out at night, pulled the panes apart, put a radiant barrier in the middle, and put the panes back together and reinstalled them before the next day. So they did one floor at a time, and they had a whole factory set up on a floor that just was a window remanufacturing thing. So the embodied energy input of that is the plastic film and the labor. They saved the whole window and all the glass. So it's kind of amazing. They also looked at the boilers. There were radiant radiators set into the wall of the building that had no insulation behind them. So when you turned the radiator on, most of the heat went out through the brick to the outside. All they did was put a radiant barrier behind the radiator and reinstall the barrier. So it was a very simple, targeted way of doing energy efficiency upgrade, insulation upgrade, without insulating the entire building, which is a building would be hard to insulate the whole building. They also, go back here. They did a retrofit of the chiller plant. The original budget had them replacing the whole chiller plant, and by reducing loads, they were able to retrofit the existing plant. And they put in a variable air unit, air volume, air handling units instead of the fixed ones they had before. And they were able to make 2 per floor instead of 4 on each floor. So they did, these are just the 4 measures they did that were actually physical measures. They also did a whole lot of measures that were like controls, balancing things, educating the tenants on how to use things better. So each one, they added up to a 38% reduction, and it was very low embodied carbon investment. They'd replace the whole chiller plant. That would have been big, but they just retrofitted it. So it was a very smart way to do it. And they weren't really looking at carbon, but that's actually wrong. That's actually 8.3 thousand metric tons a year is the savings. That's a typo there. So because they started out with 25,000 tons and they sort of saved 38%. So this is just an example of a very smart remodel that was very integrated, and everything played on. By doing some things, they were able to not replace the whole chiller plant, things like that. So this is a very smart project that I just wanted to. You can see that the payback over in the bottom there, $13 million extra, and the savings was $4.4 million. So it's a 3-year payback for all of this investment. That's a very good investment. I talked with Rocky Mountain about this, and they said that typically on commercial buildings like this, they're getting about a 38% improvement. That's their average for their building when they do this kind of retrofit. We'd like to go higher, but that's great they're doing that much. So that's it.
Thanks. Do you want to give a round of applause to our speakers? If you want to come back up here. Thank you all. Wow, that was a lot of information. Who learned something new? Who feels a little overloaded? It's kind of, energy efficiency just got a lot more complicated, I think, is the sense that I'm getting. And yet, it's tempting to kind of run away and be like, oh, well, I'm just going to keep focusing on just my energy efficiency. I can't deal. But that's kind of the nature of the whole climate crisis, right? This is just yet another inconvenient truth that we know. What are we going to do about it? So I think it raises the level of complexity and the sophistication that we as energy efficiency and climate professionals need to get to. So I have some questions about that and about how do you deal with complexity and applying it to kind of the local government role, but we've only got 10 minutes. So I kind of instead want to open it up to folks with their burning questions, and reminder that there are mics floating around for the folks on the webinar to be able to hear. So are there any questions? two here, one back there, and then Sarah, I don't know.
Hi, Nick, you mentioned storage at some point. I'm curious to know your opinion, everyone's opinion, whether you'll see storage as being part of a solution offered by utilities and the grid, or will you see that becoming part of a building infrastructure, like you're seeing the UPSs and the data centers? Will we have that as a tool moving forward to be able to answer and provide more flexibilities to our buildings?
Test. Sweet. All the above. Yeah. And it's going to take, there's not one, I think this is going to be a theme. There's not one single answer to this or even a small subset of answers to this. It's going to be a really comprehensive, intentional approach. There's interesting things with energy storage, right? So the typical technologies, batteries, right, or most people think of batteries, which have embodied carbon impacts as well, and they're using lithium and extraction and other requirements. But I think it's going to be at the building level, both for energy storage, but also as a resiliency option to replace maybe a diesel generator or a gas generator. So you get a lot of co-benefits on the building side. You get economies of scale on the larger grid side as well. There's a lot of other technologies out there other than battery storage that accomplish a very similar thing, right? So I mentioned the water heater. That's a form of what's called thermal energy storage. So I'm just using the water to store energy. You can use buildings to store energy. So if your building has a lot of thermal mass to it, you can heat it during the day or cool it during the day and then have it ride overnight. And there's one other one. Oh, electric vehicles. So, you know, in Japan, they already have electric vehicles that are bidirectional, right? Vehicle to grid technology. So as we start to get smart about where we put electric vehicle charging stations, both during the day and at night at the workplace, then we can use those electric vehicles to store and then discharge as needed.
Just one other thing, we're working on a project, a potential project for a block scale storage, which is looking at a block scale. You can actually think beyond batteries and maybe look at flywheel storage and things like that that make no sense at an individual house, but they're actually great opportunities to do it at a larger thing. The other thing I would say to that is that just even adding storage for one night, if we look at just the energy curve on a diurnal thing, the dirty energy comes at night. If you could just get through the night, that would make a huge difference, not like 2 or 3 days or all that stuff. So
my general sense is that a lot of these products with lower embodied carbon, be it insulation, concrete, or the heat pump that uses carbon dioxide instead of other refrigerants, there's always quite a price premium. Curious whether that is accurate, if there's examples that are counter to that, and then also just sort of what your recommendations are to get people to use them anyway. Does that take regulation? Does that take a financial incentive? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, sometimes there are price premiums when some new startup company has a cool product that hasn't gone to scale yet. That basic story. But what I'm encountering in the world just of concrete, and I think this would apply to other things too, but it's a very hidebound industry. Not just that it resists risk, it resists change. It's really hard to get people in the building industry to do something different than what they're used to doing. Larry and I did a project 20 years ago in Livermore. It was a very cool project converting an old sanitarium into a place where inner city kids and kids with terminal illness could go and be outside for a while. It had a straw bale dining room and an earth and pool house. It was a wonderful project. And we built these cabins for these kids with optimum framing, studs at 24 inches, single top plates, things that are a little bit different than what people are used to. Not even that freaky. They're in the building code, but it's not what people are used to. And everybody was into it. I'm the engineer. I was the engineer. I was into it. I would have been this. So it was all cool. And the lumber arrived on the site, and the crew was standing there. Their boss wasn't going to be there for 4 hours, and they just started building what they were used to building. And by the time, in fact, they'd framed half the cabins with studs at 16 inches on site. It illustrates the fact that it's not so much overt resistances. It's just very, very hard to get people to change their behavior. And in construction, if you're going to change the way people do it. So in concrete, most of the ways to make low carbon concrete are cheaper. Use less cement. It's the most expensive part of concrete. Use waste products instead of cement, etc. So very often, happily, it's a low-cost solution, but it requires a hell of a lot of effort to get everybody along the chain all the way. We thought we had everybody on that chain. Everybody involved was signed on and enthusiastic, but the lumber arrived and the guys were standing there and they did what they knew how to do. So that's really one of the big obstacles, as much if not more so than cost.
Sand and water heaters, they're a lot more expensive, but the cost of a water heater in an overall project is so tiny. It's like $3,000 instead of $600. But so it's going to be a problem to change that, change it to scale. But
Yeah, you're exactly right. And like in a multi-million-dollar project, we're talking about like $250,000 line item. But yeah, I think there is a cost premium on some of these technologies, both on the manufacturer side, just because of scale. A lot of it is on the installation side as well. And this is just because of the unknown by installers and contractors. And so the more that we can do to get education out there to folks so that they don't build risk or the unknown into their pricing, and the more we can generate consumer demand so that there's more competition for that, then I think the price will go down. I actually think that the labor is probably 50% or more than the cost.
one more thing, one of the hardest things we've had to change out is foam insulation. It works so well. You put it up over the backing for your fighting, you can nail right through it. It's rigid, it seals your building, really high insulation value, and it's in code. And so if you want to switch to something other than foam, you're looking at high density rock wool or something like that. It still often requires a furring strip. You're furring and installing the foam. You're not just putting a piece of it, even though you can. Most people with nail on the siding don't like that. Cheaper or less or more expensive, but that people installing the one. That's a really key. They have to retrain.
Sarah, you asked a component of that is like what could be policy mechanisms or what could local governments do about it. And that's a great item for discussion in the next session. But I'll first introduce that even if you priced carbon, these carbon emissions are not being measured. The embodied carbon emissions are not being measured at all. They're invisible. They're outsourced. We're not, you can't regulate something that you're not even measuring, I guess. Or even incentivize something that is invisible. So I would say that the whole industry moving towards LCA and getting that data more visible and out there is great, and we should be following that. One of the things that Bruce introduced in Materials Palette is kind of without having to go into the nitty-gritty measurements, there are best practices already available that we could be promoting as incentives or as policy. Any other questions? Wait for the mic.
Hey, it's for Bruce. So if I'm a developer and I'm going to build like a tall skyscraper, right, one across the street, is there today basically a zero carbon concrete solution? Like not reduce the amount of carbon emissions, like zero. So what's my best alternative at that point?
Not a simple answer. I went over the array of strategies that in combination can get you way, way, way down. Give it time, use less cement, use more waste products like slag or fly ash. All the strategies that I outlined would be part of reducing it hugely. I've been a structural engineer for 40 years, and every concrete I've ever specified on every job from a small house to I worked on high-rise buildings here 30 years ago. Had way, way, way more cement than it needed. And the reason was because nobody cared. It was cheap insurance to never get called back. You knew you were going to have the strength you needed. It's really expensive when something goes wrong with your concrete. There's a whole lot of stuff. So nobody wants that to happen. We just throw another bag of cement in there and nobody thought about it. Now we have to think about it. So we're trying to turn that around. So getting to zero carbon concrete is very much possible, but would be daunting today in today's market. But reducing it by half is almost It's easy. You just have to pay attention and do it.
You know, the other thing is you can do a really tall wood building. It's not as tall as the Salesforce Tower probably right now, but you can do a really tall wood building. So your decision might be, okay, I can switch to wood, which is hugely less, but it limits how high I can go. So that's a decision you have to make as a developer. Is it worth it to go 20 stories instead of 40 stories? You know, is it still viable? Yeah, right.
There's a related answer, which is that how tall is too tall? Now, we build tall buildings because there's money in it for the developer to do so, for all the reasons obvious and probably some that are not obvious. But there are a variety of metrics that are emerging to show us that maybe 10, 12 stories is as high as we really want to be going. We could still have all the density we want to have in cities without a lot of detriment, and then we can do truly low carbon buildings. You might not specifically get the concrete down where you want it, but the whole building can be substantially. The carbon intensity per square foot of a very tall building is way higher than for shorter buildings. There's 1,000 arguments against really tall buildings. I used to work on them, believe me, and I wouldn't want to be in one. I just avoid them. No, not because I think they're going to fall down. Tilt a little bit, but they're not going to fall down. But you know, when something goes wrong, if the elevator gets stuck, tallest building in the world in Abu Dhabi, a few months after it opened, the elevators froze, and people were up there, quarter of a mile in the air, stuck there. I don't want to experience that. So there's a lot of arguments against doing really tall, and then once you get down to a manageable size, 10, 12, 15 stories, opens up the palette to building everything with wood, using a lot less concrete, etc. You can have. Larry and I could design for you a 15-story building for downtown San Francisco that would have 10 or 20% of the carbon intensity of the average building of today. Would be my guess.
There's a lot of complex issues of land use and VMT and all that. So fun stuff. I see Alice raising her hand back there, and then that'll be it.
Not to broaden it further, but I'm wondering if just in the exploration of CLT and of fly ash and slag, I'm wondering if we can even broaden the conversation more beyond emissions and talk a little bit about the health impacts. I've read Mia's like, stop it. But I mean, so it's a lot harder to quantify, and especially for local government folks who work on climate specifically. But are there impacts in terms of the materiality? I know at the Carbon Smart Building Day, we talked a little bit about, well, we can build these CLT buildings, and then what about all the glue that we're using, and what happens to that at the end of its life? Is that something you guys can speak to?
Ours? Yes. Those of us who work in this stuff are thinking about this, for sure. And like the glue by which we glue wood back together to make cross-laminated timber or glue lambs, or all the things by which you can do a massive timber structure. They're not particularly pleasant to be around when you're doing it, but by the time they've gotten to the building and are installed, they're not off-gassing anymore. So there's not really a lot of effect. But as a sort of a large footnote, one of the big bullseyes in the material realm, besides Portland cement and foam insulation, how can we get something better than that? Is glue. The glue we use to glue wood together, if somebody can come up with a glue that meets all the criteria of the industry, then we could not only be gluing all sorts of pieces of wood together, like harvesting all the beetle kill pine out of the Sierra and reducing the fire hazard and then turning it into building products, and there are people working on that, but also taking all sorts of agricultural byproducts like straw, hemp, and turning them into blocks and panels and so on, if you had a good, cheap, effective glue. And also, one of the criteria is it doesn't poison people in off-gassing. So we're always keeping an eye on these things for sure. You've got a few more hours, I'll tell you more.
Okay, so we're at about break. Edgar, do you got something
just a comment from the webinar, if that's okay. So just from Alice Lapierre regarding radiant barriers. So a great example of using them in a retrofit behind an existing radiator it would seem that the same thing could be done by adding a radiant barrier window film on the existing glass windows to reject solar gains and retain heat in winter.
Great. Let's give our panelists another round of applause. Thank you so much.